Welcome to Trauma Undone. I am your host, Natasha Phillips, and today we have with us Joy Jacobs, clinical psychologist and a person who has been on a journey of self-discovery and is dedicated to helping others. Joy, we are so happy to have you with us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
So Joy, I know you have your own story as to how you got to where you are. I mean, you started off on a very different path. So I'd love to hear a little bit about that.
Wow, it's a long story. I turned 50 last week, so I feel quite like I have a long journey, but I'll try to put it in a nutshell. You know, I was a chubby child growing up who wanted to be a ballet dancer, and that led me on a path to disordered eating and very serious eating disorders that I struggled with for many years. And then thought I wanted to be a lawyer and found myself in law school and practically killing myself with that eating disorder. And I eventually left the law and left that path, found recovery, and then really committed myself to helping people who were in the very same situation that I had been. I spent many years looking for effective treatment and could not find it. And so I really decided to dedicate my life to helping people through these kinds of situations and just helping people in any kind of trauma that they've experienced that I could get trained to help them with through various techniques like emotional freedom techniques, psychotherapy, different kind of energy tools, anything and everything that I could learn to help people heal.
That's pretty amazing. I love that journey. And I just talk from experience. I'm no expert, but the things that I've read and the people that I've been exposed to, they two go hand in hand. There is some kind of trauma that happens either prior to an eating disorder or afterwards, and they get linked together. So can we discuss like how they play a part in each other's, they play a part being connected to each other?
Absolutely. It's a great question because for many years, the idea was that anyone who developed an eating disorder must have had some sort of trauma happen to them that then created what happened, this manifestation. The research actually shows that there are a lot of genetic foundations to eating disorders. So you could develop an eating disorder whether you've had trauma or not. But there's something, I don't want to get too technical, but it's called the diathesis stress model. And what that is there is a diathesis, which is maybe a genetic predisposition to any number of conditions. This applies to medical illnesses too. So you have a genetic tendency to develop a certain problem, but it will not actually occur. It will not manifest unless there is a stressor that kind of creates the trigger that creates a full syndrome. And so if we think about, okay, is there a genetic predisposition to eating disorders or depression or substance abuse? The research shows that there is for all of those things. You enter a stress, like a traumatic event or a series of traumatic events, and that creates that condition that the person ends up struggling with, whether it's an eating disorder, whether it's depression, whether it's substance abuse or some other situation, chronic medical illnesses. So I believe it's a combination of those two that really create what people experience when they suffer with problems with their eating, with their body image, or any other kind of mental health condition. Now, the process of suffering from an eating disorder, for example, is traumatic in and of itself because of the self-abuse that's part of it, the shame, the guilt, and all the things that any addict will do to kind of keep their addiction going. Makes people cross lines and boundaries that they thought they never would, whether it's in their relationships, whether it's at work, in their behavior with friends and family. And so that in and of itself creates further trauma. So the person may have had a trauma history, and then the condition itself creates more trauma. So there is a lot to work with there.
Yeah, that does. That sounds like there's so much, because my brain is just going now because it leads to so many things. Like you're saying, this self-abuse. And it made me think of this beautiful quote. I read The Four Agreements years ago. This quote didn't stand out to me. I was recently gifted to it by another guest that I had on my show. And so I was like slowly working through it. And there was this quote and it just completely jumped out at me. And it was that you let other people abuse you to the standard that you abuse yourself. So until you raise your own standards, you're always going to be abused. And when you get into the cycle of an eating disorder, you are continuously abusing yourself, which puts you on an abusive cycle. So I'm sure it just spirals down. And then you are allowing other people to do that to you as well. So you can get completely trapped into this abusive cycle, not only with yourself and with others. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. And it really does come down on a lot of levels to one's feelings of worthiness or not feeling worthy. Many people that I have worked with over the course of my career fundamentally feel unworthy. And so they don't even know that they deserve to treat themselves better and with love and kindness and care, because maybe they were never treated that way by anyone. And so they feel like they need to either look a certain way or be a certain way to be worthy of love, both from others and from self. And so a big portion and process that we take charge of in recovery is really cultivating those feelings of self-worth from within, so that it's not conditional upon what is the number on the scale, what is the size of my clothing, does he think I look good, does she say I look great, at the store, am I fitting into a size 0? All those things become conditional sources of self-worth, which can really be removed at a moment's notice. And so the path of recovery is really a process of creating something that's more lasting, hopefully.
And have you found that people who have had eating disorders are more prone to being in abusive relationships?
That's a great question. I don't have a data-driven answer for that, but from my experience, I have found that people who have disordered eating and eating disorders, especially people who had them for many years, have a lot of feelings of shame and, again, that lack of worthiness, and they are willing to accept relationships that their healthy self would not tolerate, because it's almost like this kind of scarcity mentality of not feeling like they deserve more or better or different. And so people can get trapped into really toxic relationship cycles. And if someone has, let's say they've had an eating disorder and then they find recovery and then they get into what turns out to be a toxic relationship, that can be a trigger for relapse and for a resurgence of behaviors that maybe hadn't happened for many years.
That's interesting. And then also, have you found that people who are in abusive relationships, they can develop an eating disorder even though they didn't have one before?
Absolutely. Again, if we look at that diathesis stress model, the stress of being in an abusive relationship can create many, many conditions, health conditions, medical conditions, emotional and psychological conditions, as well as eating disorders.
I find it so fascinating because I find like I also grew up in a ballet world, and those kind of things are normal. I mean, I remember hearing the story when I was young, because my ballet teacher was actually very adamant that we weren't going to develop eating disorders. She sent us to the institution in South Africa where people have their eating disorders dealt with, because she wanted us to volunteer there.
Wow.
To see what it was like on the other side of it. So we experienced that. But then I also remember hearing the story when I was young, is that the one ballet company in South Africa had to regularly replace the toilet pipes because they were binging and purging so much. And I find that that's just such that behavior becomes completely self-abusive and a means of self-control, like controlling one's environment internally instead of externally. So when you're working with somebody, how do you get them to release that control? Because they're hanging on to the way of eating or the way of punishing themselves in that manner, and if I'm talking out of turn, you absolutely correct me, but they're holding on to that for a sense of control. So how do you, navigate that space and give them where the control becomes internal in a different way?
Such a great question. And I think the first step in that process is really helping the person understand that this sense of control that they feel through their eating disorder is actually a total lack of control and is creating complete chaos and powerlessness in their life. I had a client who all the pipes in her apartment building had to be replaced because of her binging and purging, and she never was able to actually tell the people in the building that she was kind of the culprit. But the plumbers were saying, we don't understand it. And the pipes were finding all this food and all this stuff, and the shame that went with that. And situations like that really highlight the lack of control. So part of the denial of many conditions like eating disorders is this idea that like I'm in control and this makes me powerful, but it's contingent upon either restricting, having access to food to binge on, privacy to purge, the fact that is the purging even going to work? Like all these things that are really not 100%. And usually people have to hit some sort of bottom with their condition before they're willing to change, because that sense of powerfulness and control is real to the person experiencing it. And it's kind of like the devil that you know versus the devil that you don't know. And so it can be really scary, especially if someone is in a toxic relationship, to give up the thing that feels like it's helping them cope. So sometimes step one needs to be to extricate oneself from these, relationships that are triggers and things of that nature, so that they have the space and the courage to start to do things differently.
So when someone comes to you for the first time, and maybe they're coming to you for something completely different, and you realize that they actually have an eating disorder, how do you start to unpack that with them?
Most people honestly do come to me already knowing that they have problems with their eating, but there are some people who come in for something else, and then it becomes clear that whether it's an eating disorder or alcohol abuse or substance abuse, something else is really kind of like creating chaos in a lot of different areas. And so I think the key is to tap into the person's internal motivation, things within themselves that make them want to have a shift. And so it could be like, I can't go out to meals. Like social life, most social life takes place in settings where there is food involved. And people with serious eating disorders will choose to stay home rather than to have a social life. Maybe they're feeling like, oh, I've had many women who decide that they want to start a family, and they can't because of their eating disorder. Their body has shut down. And so that becomes a motivation to start to get healthy again. So in those situations, usually even if the person isn't coming in asking for that help, there is destruction and wreckage in other areas of their life that they want to fix. And that becomes really pivotal to fixing everything else.
And when they start working with you, and you are just such a success story in yourself, like your whole journey and everything. And I know you didn't even mention this. You were destined to be an attorney. You went to Harvard Law School, the most prestigious law school that you can go to.
Right.
And you made a complete 180.
Yes.
So, I love that. Like, you are a shining example of what you do and how you live. So I want to say, so what is the time frame? So somebody comes to you, there's the trauma around the eating, there's otherwise, maybe even if it's not an eating issue, it's just there's trauma with this person. Do you say, okay, we can start to see a light at the end of the tunnel, in this period of time, or is it more kind of a go with the flow process?
It's a little bit of both. It's highly dependent on the individual. So number one is the person's motivation and willingness to change and willingness to try things that they have not tried before. So recovery, the great news about eating disorder recovery is that we don't need to fix every trauma and heal every trauma in order to start healing the eating disorder. We can start to separate out the two, which I think is a really important process. I believe in trauma recovery that the slower that we go, the better. I don't believe in rushing process from healing of trauma because there is so much stuff that comes up along the way, and people can hit an emotional overload if you do too much too quickly. But on the food front, we can start to see results in weeks and even a few months, dramatic changes in people's behavior and habits if they're willing to do things differently. But if they want to come to me and keep doing everything that they've been doing and not change anything, then no change is going to happen, right? Because if we don't change what we're doing, we're going to have the same results that we've always had.
So when somebody does come to you, I wanted to ask, so do you find that because they are, there's the trauma, there's the eating disorder, there's some kind of nutrient deprivation, and they're lacking in some way, does that, when you start to see a change in diet and a change in a person's habits, do you start to see a change in their mental space? Like, even if we don't do any therapy, just by changing those few things, do you start to see a change in their mental health?
Absolutely. And, I don't feel comfortable even diagnosing anyone with depression or anxiety until their eating disorder is under control, because someone who appears depressed and anxious who also has an eating disorder, that depression and anxiety may be a result of their eating disorder, both the behaviors and some of the nutritional deficiencies that you're talking about, and the neurotransmitter imbalances and all these things that happen on a biochemical level when someone has an eating disorder. So I think it's very multifaceted. But yes, making those changes can make really dramatic differences in how people feel. Now, some people, I have to say, full disclosure, some people feel worse before they feel better. If their body hasn't really digested food in many years, it can feel really uncomfortable. And so we have some tools to suggest to people, like digestive enzymes and eating foods that are blended, almost like treating yourself as if you were a baby or a toddler at first, when you're kind of nursing yourself back to health because your body is broken by this disease on one level or another.
So, I mean, that is also such a huge change for somebody. Is it a, I mean, when you decide that you want to go on this healing journey, whatever it may be that you're healing from, and you mentioned there's like a biochemical change in the body. Trauma itself can create a biochemical change in the body. And so how are those two the same or different?
That's so interesting. So I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, because you may be more up to date on this specific research than I am. I believe that they studied PET scans and they did MRIs of people who had trauma history and found that the hippocampus was shrunken. Mm-hmm. The hippocampus is the memory center of the brain, and that people who had trauma history actually had these neurobiological changes that they believe were a result of the trauma. And this is very much the case of people with eating disorders and food addiction. They find, like, if they compare the brains of eating disordered subjects versus normal controls, certain areas of the brain light up in ways that they shouldn't be lighting up when they do these PET scans, almost like when food is introduced as if it were cocaine or heroin. Sometimes the effect is even more pronounced than in these drugs that are not even legal. And so there is definitely an altered response to food or food-related stimuli in people who have eating disorders. Now, it's not 100% clear, were those alterations there before, and that's why they developed this disordered pattern, or is it a result? So the research is still trying to figure that out. And, it's really important research because it helps to really start to dictate more effective treatments, because particularly within the eating disorders field, it has had a remarkably low recovery rate compared to some other conditions.
Well, like other conditions, you can completely cut out the thing that you're trying to avoid. And with food, you cannot.
Exactly. So it is one of the toughest conditions to deal with because pure abstinence is not an option.
So there are these different things that happen in the brain. So my question is, and I'm sure I know the answer because we're sitting here together, but I want everyone to hear it. Can you heal that? Can you heal the brain?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And food is our medicine. So we start to heal the brain, number one, for the person with the eating disorder by healing our relationship with food, giving our body what it needs. I believe that meditation, nervous system regulation in general is pivotal both for anyone who's had trauma and or an eating disorder, because a lot of these dysfunctional behaviors develop as a result of trying to numb out and find ways to find relief and coping with extreme stress and chronic stress. And when we start to teach people techniques to rebalance their nervous system, everything changes.
It's so interesting. I like, because that was also a big part of my journey. It was like that, figuring out like, how do I take care of myself?
Right.
I think, eating disorders, traumas, people start to put themselves last in the line. But you have an incredible program as well that's all about self-love.
Yes.
And, that's kind of where we are. We've spoken about the traumas and the things like this, but let's talk about like how important self-love is on this journey.
It is, I think, the most important thing, and it's maybe one of the hardest things to attain because, especially if you've grown up in a traumatic environment, you were either told that you were not lovable, that you were not good enough, or that you were only lovable if you behaved a certain way or had certain achievements or kept certain secrets. And so that's all very conditional. And to teach people this idea of unconditional self-love, there's actually a lot of resistance to it, even for people who think that they want it, because it is so foreign. And our world is built on, many marketing campaigns that tell us if we buy this product, or we go to this school, or we have this degree, or we have a certain number of dollars in the bank, that's when we're going to be worthy. And I believe very strongly that it's our energy that dictates all of that. So teaching people how to really shift their energy around this is so important. And we can start to cultivate that here or now. We can have recovery goals that take a little bit longer, but that shift in perception over self can help really the whole journey and help people stay the course. And when you actually learn to love and respect yourself, you become unwilling to abuse yourself anymore with these kinds of behaviors.
And you also stop letting other people do it. But so being on the self-love journey, I know there's, so much talk about, narcissist and selfishness.
Right.
And so can you define the difference and why self-love is not selfish and not having narcissistic traits, but it's about really taking care of yourself?
Such a great question. So when we lack self-love, we actually start to become extremely needy and extremely selfish in terms of our behavior with others, demanding that they give us what we're not giving to ourselves. And so we start being unreasonable in relationships or having unrealistic expectations of how other people should treat us or what the world owes us. And that's all coming from a lack of worthiness and self. When we start to actually invest the time to work on ourselves and cultivate real self-respect, maybe that's a better word than self-love, but real self-respect and integrity with self, we are so much better to everyone who comes into our path. I mean, think about it. If you have a rough morning and you carry that into the grocery store and project that onto the clerk in the grocery store, and then they project that onto their next customer, and that person gets in a car accident because they are distracted, it's like a domino effect, and it goes in both directions. And I truly know that when we show up as our best selves, everyone that we have contact with benefits.
That's beautiful. I love the way you describe that. Is that I just want to reiterate that because that just made so much sense for me. Is that when you don't have self-love, you're actually more selfish and more demanding on those around you, and that was like a light bulb moment for me. Because you're looking for external affirmation for who you are. So what are some recommendations that you would suggest for self-love?
So I first started learning about self-love through the work of Louise Hay, who has since passed, but she was really the pioneer of this movement towards self-love. And there are so many incredible meditations and videos on YouTube that are just available for everyone to start to understand and hear this new language. And she wrote a book called You Can Heal Your Life, which when I first read it, I was like, oh my goodness. You find yourself of two minds when at the beginning of this journey. I think you might relate, where one part of you is saying yes, yes, yes. And part of you is like, this is total BS and hocus pocus and like so cheesy. Like it's just so corny. Like I can't believe I'm reading this. But you just continue forward. And I think that it's also a process of surrounding yourself by like-minded people. So I would encourage people, there are so many incredible podcasts now about this, and to really just do it. I think affirmations are a really powerful place to start. And so, especially if someone is struggling with trauma, there may be a real challenge at feeling safe in the world or safe in one's body. And so starting out with some simple affirmations like, I am safe, putting it on a Post-it note and putting it on your bathroom mirror or on the refrigerator or by your computer or all of those places. All is well in my world. I am worthy of love. Simple affirmations like this, using them multiple times per day. I even advise people to program them into their phones and have them, 1 o'clock every day, this affirmation comes. At 3 o'clock, this one comes, because we need reminders pretty much all day, every day, that we are actually worthy of loving ourselves. If we've spent our lives hating ourselves and thinking that we are not worthy, it's going to take some repetition and consistency and consistent effort we're basically reprogramming the brain. It's a process of building a whole new pattern. And it can be really fun. And you can put it in your kids, like if you have kids in their lunchbox, like you are amazing. Like we can do that for the people that we love too.
That's so cool. I know I leave a little note in my son's lunchbox when he goes to his dad. So he opens it up and he just sees something silly. He's just learning to read, so there's always something silly there.
That's so cute.
But so I have two questions for you that have sprung from what you were talking about. I want to know, so how long does it take to reprogram the brain? Because I feel like people it's a lifelong journey.
It absolutely is a lifelong journey. I think within 3 months, people can start to feel really massive shifts in just their mood and how they feel, and starting to shift from being in a fear-driven and operating from a fear-driven space to one that is not fear-driven. So I think those kinds of changes can happen pretty quickly, but without repetition and consistency and continued effort, we can fall back into our old ways pretty easily. So I think that it does need to be, a lifelong journey, but that doesn't mean that it needs to be very effortful or that it needs to be tedious or onerous. And like I always say, we need to have fun along this journey and on this path, or otherwise we won't continue with it. So finding things and ways to make this fun for yourself, finding new teachers who inspire you, or books, or, anything that really feeds your soul, if it's making you happy when you're doing it and it is not creating any negative consequences, then you can be sure that you're on the right path.
So, do you have, do you think that once you start getting on this, you build momentum and you want to stay on this path and do these things? If in like 10 or 15 years you stop, will you revert back to your old behavior, or have you really reprogrammed yourself?
That's a great question. I think the question is, why did you stop, right? Like, I think that people maybe will retain some of the change that they've made, but can also revert back. One of the things that I do want to say about what happens when people first start making these changes is that their friends and family may not like it at all, because maybe they're also operating from this kind of negative, critical, judgmental space. And it can be scary for people close to us when we start changing and they're not. So it can happen that, especially with friendships, like certain friendships that were working before no longer work. But that doesn't necessarily have to be a bad thing, because we might be starting to up-level those relationships rather than staying like at a basement level mental wellness space with other people. But it can create shifts in relationships as well.
And do you have a ritual that you follow every day to maintain this and continue to grow?
I have so many. I mean, for me, I have to work really hard to be in a positive mindset and mind space. Number one, because I have to hold space for a lot of other people. And I grew up in a family where I think almost every family member was diagnosed with depression at one point or another. I think our biochemistry can tend toward that. So I do affirmations daily. I meditate maybe almost an hour every day. I have a bunch of different self-care practices, and I'm in community with like-minded people. And I must have contact with all of those things every day. Otherwise, I can't teach it effectively. And I don't have the kind of mental platform to be able to give anything to anyone else.
That's amazing. So I wanted to ask you, so what would you recommend is like the first step that somebody takes on their journey?
I think the first step is to just find something that resonates with you and start doing that, like for a month, not for a day or 2 days or a week, and then deciding, oh, this doesn't work or it's not helping me. Pick something like, let's say you want to start meditating. Commit to doing 10 minutes a day and do it every day for 30 days, and then decide how you feel. Things like that. If we're talking about affirmations, start out, put your little Post-it notes wherever you can with your affirmations and make sure you do them throughout the day. Commit to doing that for 30 days and then decide if it's for you or not. I think really giving things a chance to work is super important.
And to somebody who has been, who is in trauma, often making those kind of commitments seem overwhelming. Mm-hmm. So what would you recommend to them?
So if 30 days feels overwhelming, then let's start with a week. And after a week, let's say you're going to say, I'm going to spend 5 minutes a day for the next week. And then after 7 days, you can decide, do I want to commit to another week or do I want to change paths? But I think that once people start to experience really immediate benefits from some of these practices, it almost becomes self-sustaining and they can't imagine living without it.
Yeah, I know that's like for me, like when I got back into meditation, like I stopped for a period of time. And I got back into it. I was like, I am never missing a single day.
Same happened to me. I think I stopped meditating for like 2 years after being a really steady meditator. And once I got back to it, I was like, there's no way I'm ever stopping again.
Yeah, definitely not. Joy, it has been a joy being here with you today. I I've learned so much, and just been so wonderful to speak with you. So where can people find you?
Thank you so much for having me. It's been such a pleasure to be here. I'm at Dr. Joy Jacobs. That's my website, and the same on Instagram and Facebook, and you can find me there.
Great. So definitely go check out Dr.